They left no written records, no grand palaces, no empires carved in stone. Yet without them, cities would never rise, languages would not spread, and human history as we know it would not exist. Thousands of years before pharaohs ruled Egypt, or kings sat on thrones, a quiet revolution took root in the soil, in the seeds, in the hands of Neolithic farmers. This is the forgotten story of how a few simple villages changed the fate of humanity. For over 95% of human history, there were no farms, no plows, no wheat fields, no permanent houses. The ancestors of modern humans lived in small, mobile bands, rarely numbering more than a few dozen, moving with the seasons, following herds, and foraging for wild plants. This was not a brief chapter. It was the human way of life for nearly 300,000 years. They hunted using stone tools, wooden spears, and much later bows and arrows. They gathered berries, roots, nuts, and leaves. Fish were caught from rivers and lakes. Shellfish were pried from coastal rocks. Everything they ate was wild, unpredictable, and tied to the rhythms of nature. This foraging lifestyle meant constant movement. People traveled by foot across wide landscapes, woodlands, savannas, river valleys, carrying only what they could hold. Their shelters were temporary, animal hides stretched over wooden frames, or caves when they could find them. Fire was not just warmth, it was protection, cooking, and a central gathering point. Their survival depended on intimate knowledge of their environment. They understood animal behavior, plant cycles, migration patterns, and weather shifts in ways modern people rarely can. A misread season, a poor hunt, or a failed migration could mean death. But life wasn't all hardship. Archaeological evidence, from sites like Sungir in Russia, dating back nearly 30,000 years, reveals burials with ivory beads, elaborate tools, and red ochre. These were not just practical societies, they had ritual, meaning, and beauty. Tools were finely crafted, clothing sewn with bone needles, and bodies decorated. Art appeared tens of thousands of years before agriculture. The cave paintings of Lascaux in France, the hand stencils in Indonesia, the Venus figurines of Ice Age Europe. These were not simplistic people. Their minds, bodies, and social structures were fully modern. Social organization among hunter-gatherers was largely egalitarian. Without stored wealth, land ownership, or complex hierarchies, decisions were often made communally. Leadership existed, but it was typically based on respect and ability, not force. Everyone had a role: hunting, gathering, tool-making, childcare. Mobility discouraged the accumulation of possessions or power. If conflict arose, the group could simply leave. But the life was precarious. The Pleistocene climate was volatile. Periods of warming and cooling brought floods, droughts, and the expansion and retreat of ice. Around 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, vast parts of the Earth were locked under ice sheets. Sea levels dropped by over 100 meters. But as the ice began to melt, around 15,000 years ago, the climate entered a warmer, more stable phase. River valleys like the Euphrates, Nile, Indus, and Yangtze began to offer consistent water, fertile soil, and growing animal populations. This environmental stability created new opportunities. In regions like the Fertile Crescent, certain wild grasses, summer wheat, barley grew in abundance. Herd animals like goats, sheep, and pigs grazed nearby. Foragers began to return to the same locations more frequently, perhaps staying longer each season. Some groups experimented with planting seeds or penning animals. Not agriculture, not yet, but the first steps toward it. Around 12,000 years ago, in sites like Abu Huraira, in modern Syria, archaeologists have found evidence of this transition. People were still foraging, but began cultivating wild cereals. As more food became available in one place, group sizes grew. Larger settlements appeared. Burials suggest growing differences in status. The social fabric was changing, and with change came trade dash-offs. Hunter-gatherers had a varied diet, rich in wild meats, fruits, nuts, and vegetables. Early farmers, by contrast, relied heavily on a few crops, often lacking nutritional diversity. Skeletons from early agricultural societies show signs of anemia, tooth decay, and stunted growth. With stored food came rodents and insects. Settled life brought waste accumulation and water contamination. Diseases that struggled to spread among small, mobile groups now found fertile ground in denser populations. Workloads shifted to where foraging might demand a few hours of effort per day. Early farming required long, repetitive labor, clearing land, planting, weeding, harvesting, storing. Injuries from hard labor appear in bones and joints. So why, given these hardships, did people persist? Part of the answer lies in numbers. A single field of grain could feed more people than the same land could provide through foraging. Food surpluses allowed populations to grow. As bands became villages, the option to go back disappeared. Farming created a feedback loop. More food supported more people, and more people needed more food. The cycle locked in. Another factor was permanence. With settled life came a sense of place. Ancestors were buried in the ground. Rituals were tied to the land. People began to build not just shelters but homes. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, built around 9600 BCE, suggests that spiritual or religious motivations may have played a role. Its massive stone pillars predate agriculture in the region, hinting that communal gathering or worship may have been part of what bound people to fixed locations. The shift wasn't universal, nor was it fast. In some places, like the highlands of Papua New Guinea or the Arctic tundra, people continued foraging well into modern times. Even in areas where farming took root early, it took centuries, sometimes millennia, for it to fully replace mobile life. Still, by around 8000 BCE in the Fertile Crescent, and slightly later in China, Mesoamerica, and the Andes, farming had become a dominant force. The age of the forager gave way to the age of the farmer, and with that, the human story began to change permanently. Land became property, surplus became wealth, hierarchies emerged, villages turned into cities. The long, uncertain freedom of the hunter-gatherer slowly gave way to the structured, settled world of civilization. The plow would soon carve lines, not just into soil, but into history itself. Around 11,600 years ago, something changed. Not all at once, not everywhere, but gradually across hills, river valleys, and plains that had known only the rhythms of wild foraging for tens of thousands of years. In regions stretching from the Levant to the Zagros Mountains, small bands of people began to act differently. Seeds were gathered not just for eating, but for planting. Wild animals were not just hunted, but for the first time, humans began altering the land in ways that would reshape their destiny. The transition from foraging to farming did not begin with plows or permanent villages. It began with observation patterns of seasonal growth, animal migration, and climate change. During the Younger Dryas, a cold snap that struck around 12,900 years ago, the global climate dipped sharply, rainfall decreased, plants struggled, game became less predictable. In the Levant, where wild wheat and barley once grew abundantly, conditions became harsher. This environmental stress likely pressured human communities to innovate. At sites like Abu Huraira in modern-day Syria, archaeologists have found evidence of foragers turning to early cultivation. Inhabitants gathered wild cereals like einkorn wheat, pounding and grinding them with stone tools. Over time, selective gathering may have unintentionally favored non-shattering seed heads plants, whose grains clung to the stalk, making them easier to harvest, and eventually more suited to domestication. By around 9600 BCE, in the hills of southeastern Anatolia, a site was constructed that has challenged assumptions about pre-agricultural societies. Göbekli Tepe, situated on a limestone plateau in present-day Turkey, contains some of the world's oldest known megalithic structures. T-shaped stone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, were arranged in circular enclosures. Carvings of animals, lions, snakes, vultures covered the surfaces. There were no signs of permanent settlement, no domestic structures. Yet the effort required to build and maintain Göbekli Tepe was massive. The people who built it were still hunter-gatherers. They had no farms, no domesticated animals. But the site suggests something more, a communal or religious purpose that required coordination, planning, and perhaps seasonal gatherings. Some archaeologists have proposed that the construction of such sacred places may have been a driving force behind sedentism. That religion didn't arise from farming it, may have preceded it. Meanwhile, roughly 800 kilometers to the south, another site emerged that would reflect the opposite end of the spectrum. Jericho, located in the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea, is one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth. By around 9000 BCE, its people had begun to establish permanent homes. Round, mud brick dwellings clustered together within an early settlement. A massive stone wall surrounded part of the site, and a stone tower nearly 9 meters high was built inside. These were not the scattered camps of nomads. This was a community that stayed in place. The people of Jericho practiced a form of pre-pottery, Neolithic farming. They cultivated cereals and likely managed herds of animals. Nearby springs provided a steady water source, and the surrounding land supported early irrigation. Archaeological remains show the presence of wheat, barley, lentils, and legumes, beginning to show signs of domestication. They still hunted wild gazelle and deer, but cultivated foods were becoming central. Domestication was not limited to plants. Around 10,000 years ago, evidence from sites like Kayan in Turkey and Ganj in Iran shows that people began managing animals. Goats were among the first. Their behavior, herding, grazing, and relatively docile nature made them suitable. Candidate selective breeding favored animals that were easier to manage, had better meat yields, and eventually produced more milk. Sheep, pigs, and later cattle followed. This process, what scholars now call the Neolithic Revolution, was not a singular event, but a slow, uneven transition that unfolded over centuries. In the Fertile Crescent, it moved from foraging with cultivation to cultivation with foraging, and finally to full-time agriculture. In China, millet and rice were domesticated independently. In Mesoamerica, people cultivated maize, squash, and beans. And in the Andes, potatoes and quinoa were grown thousands of years before Spanish conquest. Theories about why this transformation happened remain debated. One explanation ties it to climate. As the last ice age ended, global temperatures stabilized. This allowed certain plants and animals to thrive in concentrated areas, encouraging people to return to the same regions season after season. Eventually, some stayed. Another theory points to population pressure. As communities grew, the resources of foraging territories became stretched. Farming offered more calories per acre, allowing higher population density if it demanded more labor. A third possibility focuses on cultural or spiritual motives. Sites like Göbekli Tepe suggest that symbolic or religious practices may have driven groups to settle, gather, and collaborate in new ways. The need to support ritual centers might have led to more permanent food production. Whatever the causes, the outcomes were clear. Food surpluses allowed populations to expand. Settlements grew. Social roles began to specialize. New technologies emerge: pottery, weaving, groundstone tools. But this was still the beginning. Farming would not dominate the globe for thousands of years. Even into the Bronze Age, many regions maintained a mixed strategy of farming, herding, hunting, and gathering. Still, the shift was irreversible. Once people began reshaping the landscape to suit their needs, their relationship to nature and to one another fundamentally changed. The world of mobile bands gave way to fields, granaries, walls, and the slow rise of complexity. The great experiment had begun. Civilization was no longer a possibility. It was becoming inevitable. The invention of farming altered the human condition in ways both immediate and far-reaching. With cultivated fields and domesticated animals came food. Surpluses, reliable calories that no longer depended on the uncertainty of the hunt or the luck of a foraging expedition. But these gains came with profound costs. The transition from mobile to sedentary life did not simply create villages and crops. It introduced hard labor, new diseases, deepening inequality, and environmental degradation. By 8500 BCE, settlements like Kayenne in southeastern Anatolia were home to permanent structures built from stone and mud brick. The community's residents cultivated wheat and barley, kept goats and sheep, and relied on stored food that required grinding, baking, and preservation. But this new stability demanded year-round labor. Fields needed to be cleared, seeds planted, crops tended, and irrigation maintained. Granaries had to be built and guarded. Farming was not a seasonal task, it was an unending cycle of work. Osteological evidence supports this change. Human skeletons from early agricultural sites show increased signs of physical stress. Joint degeneration, spinal compression, and repetitive strain injuries are common, particularly in knees, backs, and elbows. Women's skeletons, especially, often show extreme wear from hours spent grinding grain on stone querns. Dietary variety declined. While hunter-gatherers consumed hundreds of plant species, early farmers became dependent on just a few staples: wheat, barley, lentils. These crops were carbohydrate-rich, but lacked key nutrients. Dental analysis shows a sharp rise in cavities and enamel defects. Signs of anemia and stunted growth appear in remains from sites like Jericho and Megar. The new way of life fed more people, but not necessarily better. Farming also made humans more vulnerable to disease. Sedentary communities accumulated, waste both human and animal. With no sanitation systems, parasites and pathogens spread easily. Rodents and insects were drawn to stored food. The close proximity to domesticated animals introduced new zoonotic diseases, smallpox, measles, and influenza epidemics of later civilizations likely had their roots in this early contact. There were demographic consequences. With reliable food and permanent shelter, birth rates increased, population growth accelerated, and larger settlements became possible. But more people in tighter spaces brought new social pressures. Conflict over land and resources became more likely. In Katalyuk, a settlement that flourished between 7500 and 5700 BCE in central Anatolia, there is evidence of both cooperation and competition. Homes were packed tightly, built wall-to-wall with rooftop access. Beneath many dwellings, burials suggest lineage-based claims to household spaces. Some individuals were interred with Goodspeed's tools, pigments, while others were not. Inequality had begun to take shape. This was one of the most significant consequences of farming, the birth of social stratification. In foraging societies, mobility discouraged accumulation. Status was earned through skill and shared. But in farming communities, land and labor created surplus, and surplus enabled storage, trade, and ownership. Some individuals or families began to control more than others. Those who managed grain stores or breeding livestock held power. Roles began to specialize: toolmakers, builders, weavers, religious figures. Not everyone worked the fields. Not everyone had the same. By 7000 BCE, in regions from the Levant to Mesopotamia, elite burials began to appear. Larger homes stood beside smaller ones. Clay tokens, possibly used for accounting, merged in places like Telbrook and Susa. The mechanisms of organized society were taking root. Hierarchy, administration, and centralized decision-making became necessary to manage the growing complexity of life. With hierarchy came control over resources, people, and space. Walls were one of the first architectural expressions of this control. At Jericho, the massive stone wall and tower constructed as early as 8000 BCE stand as the earliest known examples of urban fortification. Theories about their purpose range from flood control to defense against outsiders. Either way, they reveal an increasing sense of ownership, territory, and threat. The land was no longer shared wilderness. It was claimed, enclosed, and defended. The environment, too, began to show the strain. Intensive agriculture altered ecosystems. Forests were cleared for fields. Soils were depleted from repeated planting. In Mesopotamia, irrigation systems eventually led to salinization, salt buildup in the soil, which damaged crop yields over generations. Archaeological layers at sites like Tel Leland show abrupt abandonments, possibly linked to environmental collapse. The feedback loop continued. More land was needed to feed growing populations. More work was required to support more people. The labor of farming produced food surpluses, but it also produced inequality, overexertion, and instability. The seeds of control, both in mastering crops and in organizing society, had been planted. Psychologically, the transition marked a fundamental shift. Foragers had moved through landscapes shaped by seasonal abundance and scarcity. Farmers reshaped the landscape to meet their needs. Time itself was restructured. The rhythms of planting and harvest replaced the spontaneity of foraging. Calendars began to emerge. Rituals became tied to the seasons. The land was no longer simply inhabited. It was controlled. Yet this control was never total. Communities rose and fell. Some thrived for centuries, only to vanish. Others migrated or reverted to mixed economies. Farming was not an inevitable path, nor a universally better one. It was a trade-off, one that exchanged flexibility for security, variety for volume, and equality for organization. Still, by 6000 BCE, the trajectory was set. Across the Fertile Crescent, in the Nile Valley, along the banks of the Indus and the Yellow River, the model of settled agriculture was spreading. The experiment had become a system. What had begun as an adaptation was becoming a framework for civilization, and with it came the weight of control not only over the land, but over one another. In central Anatolia, near the banks of the Konya plain, the remains of one of the world's earliest large-scale settlements lie buried beneath layers of earth and time. Excavated since the Eojoluling S. Kaital-Yuk occupied between roughly 7100 and 5700 BCE, offers one of the most detailed windows into how early farming communities lived, organized themselves, and gave meaning to their existence without rulers, written language, or warfare. At its peak, Kaital-Yuk may have housed between 5,000 and 8,000 people. That number, in the context of the Neolithic, is staggering. Yet what makes the site extraordinary is not just its size, but its structure. The settlement had no streets. Dwellings were built wall to wall, creating a honeycomb of connected mud brick homes, all accessed from the rooftops by ladders. People moved across the top of the village, with entryways descending through ceiling hatches into the homes below. These homes followed a consistent architectural plan: rectangular rooms with raised platforms, plastered walls, and central hearths. Interior spaces were cleaned and replastered. Regularly, some houses show over 100 layers of white or red plaster, each representing a generational renewal of the domestic space. There was little distinction in size or complexity between most homes, suggesting a degree of social equality, at least in household construction. But beneath the floors, a different kind of history was recorded. Excavations revealed that the dead were buried inside the homes themselves. Bodies, often placed in a flexed or fetal position, were interred beneath sleeping platforms or hearths. Some burials included grave goods, stone beads, obsidian blades, or animal remains. In a few cases, skulls were removed and plastered, possibly for display or ritual use. These burials were not anonymous. They signified ancestral presence within the home, linking generations through shared domestic space. The walls of some dwellings bore painted murals. One room displayed a scene of vultures hovering above headless figures, recurring motif across Neolithic Anatolia, possibly symbolizing death rituals or spiritual beliefs. Another shows what some scholars interpret as a map, an overhead view of the settlement with the twin peaks of Hazen Dock, a volcano to the northeast, in the background. If accurate, this could be one of the oldest known representations of a landscape. Animal symbolism was central. Bull's horns and wild aurochs skulls were embedded into interior walls, often in deliberate arrangements. Leopard images appeared in paintings and figurines. Wild animals, not domesticated livestock, dominated the symbolic vocabulary. This suggests that even as the community depended on agriculture and herding, their spiritual life remained rooted in the memory of the wild Kaital-Yuk, was part of a broader Neolithic pattern across the Near East. But it stood out for its scale and cohesion. There were no palaces, no temples, and no public monuments, yet coordination was evident. The shared building techniques, consistent floor plans, and organized spatial layout point to a community held together by custom and cooperation rather than coercion. There is no archaeological evidence of social elites. Homes were largely uniform, while some buildings were more elaborately decorated, possibly used for ritual gatherings. There is no indication that any one family or group held political dominance. No weapons caches, no defensive walls, no signs of large-scale conflict have been uncovered at the site. Social order, at least for a time, appears to have been maintained without centralized authority. Economic life revolved around a mixed subsistence strategy. People grew wheat, barley, peas, and lentils. Sheep and goats were herded for meat, milk, and wool. Obsidian volcanic glass used for sharp tools was traded from sources nearly 200 kilometers away, particularly from the Cappadocian region. The presence of obsidian blades in nearly every household suggests a distribution system that was widespread and relatively equal. Trade networks extended far beyond the village, connecting Çatalhöyük to the growing web of Neolithic exchange. Across Anatolia and the Levant, food preparation, craft production, and ritual practice all took place within the domestic sphere. Each household was a unit of labor, belief, and memory. This decentralization of activity likely contributed to the cohesion of the community. Without temples or bureaucracies, the home became the center of life, biological, spiritual, and economic. What held Çatalhöyük together was not hierarchy, but shared worldview. The repetition of building styles, burial customs, symbolic imagery, and dietary habits reflects a collective identity. The lack of formal institutions did not mean a lack of order. Instead, cultural norms enforced social coherence. People knew their roles, responsibilities, and place within the lineage. Still, the system was not static. Over time, the community grew, then declined. Later phases of the site show shifts in architecture. Rectangular buildings replaced the tightly packed honeycomb layout. Open courtyards appeared between structures. By around 5700 BCE, the site was gradually abandoned. The reasons remain unclear. Environmental pressures, resource depletion, or social transformation may have played a role. New settlements emerged elsewhere, carrying elements of Çatalhöyük's legacy forward. The rise of Çatalhöyük marked a milestone in human history. It showed that complex, large-scale communities could exist without kings, armies, or writing. Social order could be maintained through custom, belief, and cooperation. Spiritual life did not require temples. Leadership could be diffuse, grounded in shared tradition rather than command. Long before the first city-states of Mesopotamia, before ziggurats, rows, and laws were carved into stone, the people of Çatalhöyük built a society from rooftops, rituals, and memory. They left no epic monuments, but what they built endured in the very structure of community itself. The Neolithic Age was not only a shift in how people fed themselves, it was a shift in how they thought, built, and created, as small communities anchored themselves to land and cycle. Necessity drove innovation. The transition from foraging to farming didn't only bring crops and herds, it brought a new relationship to material, time, and production. The archaeological record from 10,000 to 6,000 BCE reveals a period of sustained experimentation and adaptation, where technology emerged not in isolation, but as part of a broader change in how humans organized life. One of the most visible transformations came with stone tools. In earlier periods, chipped or flaked tools defined survival. Blades were sharp, but brittle. During the Neolithic, ground and polished stone became the norm. Polishing gave tools greater durability and efficiency. Axes, adzes, and chisels made from basalt or flint were used to clear forests, shape wood, and build permanent homes. The labor of farming, forestry, and construction demanded tools that could endure, and the innovation followed. At sites like Skara Brae in the Orkney Islands and Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia, polished tools appear in almost every excavated dwelling. Axes used for tree felling, grinding stones for processing grain, and bone awls for piercing hides. All speak to daily life, now structured by routine and task. But the biggest leap in daily, material culture came with the controlled use of fire and clay. While pottery had precursors in earlier forager societies, such as the Jomon ceramics in Japan, dating back to 14,000 BCE, it became widespread across the Near East, Europe, and parts of Asia only during the Neolithic. Early pottery was hand-built, using coiling techniques, then fired in open hearths or pit kilns. These vessels were not purely decorative. They served as storage for grains, legumes, and liquid solutions to the problem of managing surplus. Some bore impressions of textiles or baskets. Others were decorated with incised patterns, perhaps marking ownership or use. In places like the Ubaid culture in Mesopotamia, pottery types became regionally distinctive, offering archaeologists a chronological tool to trace settlement patterns and trade routes. The introduction of pottery had cascading effects. Boiling food became more practical. Soups and stews replaced dry roasted or parched grains. Cooked meals became softer, easier to digest, especially for children and the elderly. This shift likely contributed to population growth and lower infant mortality. Technology wasn't just external. It affected biology. Alongside fire and clay, another innovation transformed labor: textile production. Though few actual fabrics survive from this period, impressions on clay and tools for spinning and weaving provide solid evidence. The domestication of sheep and flax created new raw materials. Spindle whorls and loom weights appear across Neolithic sites in Europe and Western Asia. Clothing, once made largely from animal hides, increasingly included woven fibers. This change wasn't purely functional. Patterns, colors, and weaving techniques offered a new way to express identity, regional affiliation, or status. Decoration, extended beyond body and houset, became part of how people marked themselves. Within growing social networks, bone, too, found new uses. While earlier hunter-gatherers had used bone for tools, Neolithic communities expanded its applications. Awls, needles, fishhooks, and combs were all made from animal remains. So were ornamental objects, pendants, beads, and figurines carved from bone or ivory reflect both technical skill and symbolic purpose. Architecture, meanwhile, evolved into a deliberate, durable medium. Mud brick homes replaced temporary shelters. In Çatalhöyük houses were carefully plastered and repaired over generations. Some contained built-in ovens, benches, storage bins, and shrines. Construction was not simply about shelter, it reflected permanence, routine, and investment in place. In Jericho, stone towers and walls from as early as 8000 BCE reflect engineering beyond basic domestic needs. The round tower, nearly 9 meters tall, was built with an internal staircase and appears to have had a functional relationship to the surrounding wall. Whether it was defensive, ceremonial, or a means to control floodwaters, it required organized labor, planning, and shared effort. Such projects suggest an emerging capacity for collective work and the coordination of resources. Community-scale construction would become a defining trait of the later Neolithic and Bronze Age, but its roots lay in these early structures, in the merging of skill, time, and surplus. By the 7th millennium BCE, new materials were also entering. The Neolithic toolkit. In parts of the Balkans and Anatolia, early copper use began to appear. Cold-hammered and shaped into small tools or ornaments, copper was still rare and not yet replacing stone. But its presence signaled an expanding awareness of the Earth's materials and what they could become. It was the beginning of metallurgy, development that would later transform warfare, labor, and social hierarchy. The spread of these technologies was not uniform. Some areas adopted pottery early, others delayed it for centuries. Textile and metal use followed no single timeline. But the common thread across regions was this: the move to settled life created the conditions for sustained innovation. Farming required tools. Storage demanded containers. Surplus allowed specialization. Repetition planting, harvesting, building, repairing encouraged refinement. The daily rhythm of Neolithic life fostered technological progress, not as a burst, but as an accumulation. People were no longer just adapting to the environment. They were modifying it, managing it, and crafting new systems to control their surroundings, themselves by shaping stone, clay, fire, fiber, and bone. Neolithic communities reshaped their world. These innovations didn't build empires or monuments, not yet, but they built the infrastructure of permanence. They set the foundation for everything that would follow. Long before roads, carts, or written contracts, Neolithic communities built invisible lines of connection across vast distances. These early networks stretched across landscapes from the Mediterranean to the Zagros Mountains, linked villages and valleys through the movement of goods, materials, and knowledge. Though small in scale compared to later empires, these trade systems show that the first farming communities were never isolated. They existed as part of a growing web exchanging more than just objects. Obsidian was among the most prized materials of the Neolithic, a natural volcanic glass. Obsidian fractures with razor-sharp edges, making it ideal for blades, scrapers, and arrowheads. But its geological sources were limited. The most prominent came from central Anatolia, particularly the volcanic fields near Cappadocia. Yet obsidian tools have been found hundreds of kilometers away in Syria, northern Iraq, Cyprus, the Levant, and even the Greek mainland, at sites like Tel Assuit in the Damascus Basin. Obsidian flakes trace a direct line to Cappadocian sources over 600 kilometers distant. This wasn't scavenging. It was sustained, directional movement, either through direct expeditions or, more likely, via a chain of exchanges from community to community. The presence of both worked and raw obsidian at these distant sites shows that some locations served as production hubs, while others received the final goods. This system wasn't limited to stone. Marine shells from the Mediterranean and the Red Sea appeared deep inland in Neolithic Anatolia and the Jordan Valley. At Catalyuk, archaeologists recovered thousands of shell beads, some crafted into ornaments, others left whole. These shells originated from the Gulf of Aqaba, nearly 700 kilometers away. Their presence suggests sustained contact between coastal and inland regions. These were not simple trade goods. They likely carried symbolic meaning, markers of identity, status, or distant affiliation. Red ochre and other pigments, often used for body decoration or ritual, also moved between regions in burial sites. From the Neolithic Levant to southeastern Europe, bodies were dusted with ochre, sometimes accompanied by decorative items made of exotic materials. This practice was not isolated. It points to shared symbolic traditions, possibly shaped by interaction. Across communities, the exchange of materials fostered the spread of ideas. Agricultural techniques, architectural styles, and symbolic motifs moved alongside goods. From Western Iran to the Aegean, similar forms of painted pottery, house construction, and burial practices began to appear. While there is no evidence of written language, the movement of styles and technologies implies the spread of knowledge through face-to-face contact, either through itinerant craftspeople, seasonal gatherings, or intermarriage in the Balkans and the Danube basin, where agriculture spread from Anatolia into Europe between 6500 and 5500 BCE. Obsidian from Melos and Lipari appears in early farming sites. So do ideas. Rectangular house plans, plastered floors, and baked clay figurines echo those from earlier Near Eastern settlements. These weren't migrations by conquests, they were gradual, sustained transmissions through contact, adaptation, and incorporation. Even early forms of social organization may have spread through these routes. Shared ritual practices, such as burying the dead beneath house floors, show remarkable consistency between sites in the Levant, Anatolia, and the northern Zagreb. The presence of symbolic items, figurines, carved stamp seals, and animal iconography suggests that beliefs and cultural patterns moved with people and goods. This trade did not require large-scale institutions or marketplaces. It functioned through small-scale, repeated interactions. Communities likely exchanged surplus goods, rare materials, or crafted items during seasonal events or visits. Over time, these interactions created networks without borders, currencies, or armies, but with real cultural consequences. By the late Neolithic, between 6000 and 5000 BCE, regional specialization began to appear. Some sites became known for obsidian knapping. Others produced distinctive ceramics or textiles. In the central Zagros, the site of Tepe Guron yielded mother-of-pearl ornaments sourced from distant shores. In Cyprus, obsidian, copper, and imported blades indicate the island's integration into broader mainland networks. These networks were resilient but not permanent. Climate shifts, resource depletion, or social change could disrupt them. Some trade routes faded, while others expanded. But the idea of connection endured. The Neolithic was not a static era of isolated farming villages. It was a dynamic landscape of movement, contact, and exchange. People crossed rivers, climbed mountains, and walked across plains not only to survive, but to trade, to learn, to relate. The goods they carried were more than tools or ornaments. They were markers of a world already growing larger. With the spread of farming in the Neolithic period, a profound change occurred not only in how people fed themselves, but in how they understood the world around them. Where hunter-gatherers had followed game and wild plants across landscapes, early farmers remained rooted in place. And with permanence came a different kind of relationship to land, life, and death. The rhythms of sowing and harvest, the cycles of drought and abundance, introduced new questions about fertility, survival, and continuity. Across the early agricultural world, belief systems adapted to this new reality. Religion did not disappear, it transformed. Archaeological evidence from Keitel dated between 7100 and 5700 BCE, as reveals how these early beliefs were reflected in daily life. Inside homes, bull's horns were embedded in walls, and plaster sculptures of large female figures were placed in niches. Burials took place beneath sleeping platforms. There was no separate temple structure. Ritual and the sacred were embedded in the household itself. Among the most studied figures from this site is a seated female figurine, broad-hipped, flanked by leopards, possibly giving birth. Some researchers interpret it as an early representation of a fertility goddess, though debate continues over its symbolic meaning. What is clear is that these figures were prominent in the symbolic vocabulary of the settlement, alongside animal motifs, abstract designs, and vulture imagery. Vultures, in particular, appear repeatedly in Neolithic sites of the Levant and Anatolia. In the Neolithic layers of Jericho and at sites like Ain Ghazal in modern Jordan, paintings and carvings show vultures hovering over headless human figures. At Kait al-Yuk, one wall painting shows a similar scene. These images likely reflect mortuary practices. Evidence from the site suggests that bodies may have been exposed to the elements before burial, defleshed by scavenging birds in a form of excarnation, before bones were cleaned and reinterred inside homes. The skulls of the deceased were sometimes removed and plastered, shaped into lifelike forms, and painted. These practices indicate a form of ancestor reverence, where the dead continued to play a role in the community's spiritual and social life, that the land itself took on new sacred meaning. For farmers, survival depended on the fertility of soil, the predictability of seasons, and the success of crops. In this context, religious beliefs began to reflect the agricultural calendar. Seasonal rituals, marked by planting, growth, and harvest, emerged as central components of Neolithic spiritual life. At the preparatory Neolithic B site of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Anatolia, dating to around 9600 BCE, a different kind of sacred space was constructed. The site includes multiple circular enclosures, each built from massive T-shaped limestone pillars, carved with reliefs of foxes, snakes, boars, and birds. The scale and organization of construction suggest that it was not a domestic settlement. There is no evidence of farming at the site itself, and yet the effort required to build and maintain these structures points to a high level of social cooperation. It may have been a ritual gathering place, ceremonial center used by surrounding communities that were in the process of transitioning to farming. Göbekli Tepe's carvings emphasize wild animals rather than domesticated ones. This could reflect a society still deeply influenced by a hunter-gatherer worldview, even as it approached the threshold of agriculture. The monumentality of the site, however, suggests that communal belief, expressed through shared labor and symbolic architecture, was becoming a defining part of life. As the Neolithic period progressed, permanent ritual spaces began to appear within settlements. In the Levant, sites such as Ain Ghazal began to produce larger-scale figurines made of lime, plaster, and red cores. Some stood over a meter tall. Dozens were buried in pits, never meant to be displayed for long. Their blank eyes and abstracted features offer few clues about identity or function, but they represent an investment in ceremonial production that went beyond simple decoration. The emergence of formalized burial practices also marked a shift. In earlier periods, burials were scattered and often simple. By the late Neolithic, there is evidence of structured cemeteries, grave goods, and standardized orientations of the body. In Europe, long burrows, elongated communal tombs made of earth and stone began to appear by the 5th millennium BCE. These were not just functional places for disposal of the dead. They were spaces of memory, identity, and spiritual significance. The connection between land, ancestry, and fertility became foundational. In agricultural societies, death was not an ending, it was part of the cycle, just as seeds were buried. To bring forth new life, the dead were returned to the earth, reinforcing the bond between soil and soul. Ancestors, remembered through ritual or physical remains, played a role in protecting crops, families, and settlements. The growth of ritual and religious complexity in Neolithic societies did not rely on writing or formal priesthoods. Instead, belief was expressed through material culture, figurines, burial patterns, architectural symbolism, and community events. These beliefs adapted to changing environments and social structures, responding to the challenges and demands of a farming life. By the late Neolithic, the foundation had been laid for the temples and mythologies of the Bronze Age, the gods of later civilizations, gods of harvest, fertility, storms, and underworlds had their conceptual roots in the Neolithic understanding of land and life. The earth had become not only a provider, but a presence. Farming did not merely reshape the physical world, it redefined how people understood their place in it. The Neolithic period reshaped human history, but its path was never linear. Farming allowed villagers to grow, but it also introduced new vulnerabilities. When resources failed, when the climate shifted, or when communities overreached, collapse followed. In the absence of writing, much of what we know comes from abandoned settlements, degraded soils, or layers of ash and drought-resistant dust. What emerges is a clear path. Societies adapted, migrated, or disappeared. The rise of agriculture was not guaranteed progress. It was a fragile balance in the eastern Fertile Crescent. The site of Tel Abu Herrera in modern-day Syria offers a long timeline of occupation. From around 11,000 BCE, foragers gathered wild cereals and hunted gazelle. By 9,000 BCE, they had shifted to farming, cultivating rye, wheat, and barley. For a time, the settlement thrived, growing into one of the largest known early Neolithic villages in the region. But the same factors that enabled growth sedentary life, reliance on crops, population increase created pressure. Evidence from the site shows increasing signs of soil depletion. Intensive farming without crop rotation or fallowing exhausted the land. As soil fertility declined, yields dropped. Hunting declined too, as local animal populations were driven away or overhunted. By around 6000 BCE, the settlement was abandoned. The people did not vanish, but they moved, likely joining or forming new communities elsewhere, carrying with them a memory of failure. Climate was an unpredictable force in this era. Around 6200 BCE, the Northern Hemisphere experienced a sudden drop in temperatures, now known as the 8.2 kiloyear event, triggered by a massive outflow of glacial meltwater into the North Atlantic. It disrupted oceanic circulation and altered weather patterns globally. Across the Near East and beyond, rainfall declined. In regions dependent on seasonal floods or rains to support agriculture, crop failures followed. Lake levels dropped. Grazing lands withered. Some settlements shrank or shifted locations entirely. In northern Mesopotamia, several Neolithic sites show reduced occupation during this period. At Tel Abyad in Syria, layers of settlement are interrupted by clear signs of abandonment. Some communities adapted by diversifying crops or returning to mixed economies of farming, herding, and foraging. Others relocated to more reliable water sources. Internal tensions also left their mark. At the site of Ketelyuk, which had thrived for over a millennium, later phases of occupation show signs of stress. Housing becomes more compartmentalized. Ritual elements decline in number and prominence. Burials within homes are defining traditions altogether. Trade goods like obsidian become less common. Though there is no evidence of violent destruction, the changes suggest social fragmentation. By around Wu Tensi by BCI, Ketelyuk was largely abandoned. Population may have shifted to smaller satellite villages or new regions with better agricultural potential. In Europe, similar patterns played out on different timelines. As farming spread from the Aegean into the Balkans and Central Europe between 6500 and 5500 BCE, early Neolithic cultures, such as the linear pottery culture (LBK), established longhouse villages across fertile river valleys. These communities introduced agriculture to new landscapes, but not always successfully. In parts of western Hungary and southern Germany, early LBK settlements expanded rapidly. Excavations show signs of initial abundance-rich soils, large houses, and widespread use of pottery and tools. But over time, pollen analysis reveals deforestation, erosion, and the degradation of arable land. As communities cleared trees for fields, they disrupted ecosystems. Without proper fallow cycles, the soil compacted and lost nutrients. There are also signs of violence. Mass graves near Talheim in Germany and Aspenschlitz in Austria, dated to around 5000 BCE, contained dozens of individuals with blunt force trauma and arrow wounds. In some cases, entire communities appear to have been killed. These findings suggest that intergroup conflict, perhaps over land, resources, or population pressures, played a role in the decline or collapse of some early farming settlements. Migration became a response to both environmental and social instability. Across the Danube basin, archaeological evidence shows shifting settlement patterns. Some regions were abandoned. Others, like the Tisa and Kukes valleys, saw new waves of population, often with different pottery styles and burial practices. These movements were not always peaceful or uniform. They involved assimilation, conflict, and adaptation. In the Levant and Anatolia, a similar process unfolded. As older centers declined, new cultural traditions emerged. The Halaf culture, for example, arose in northern Mesopotamia around 6000 BCE, characterized by distinct painted pottery and circular houses. Halaf communities were smaller and more dispersed than those of the preceding Ubaid culture. This decentralization may have been a strategy to cope with unpredictable climate or depleted soils. The shift suggests resilience, not abandonment, of agriculture, but a reorganization of how it was practiced. Collapse did not mean disappearance. Migration did not mean failure. These movements, adaptations, and reorganizations shaped the evolution of Neolithic society. Lessons from environmental strain, social conflict, and overuse of land laid the groundwork for later developments in water management, crop rotation, and social stratification. Early farmers did not have the luxury of hindsight. They responded to each challenge in real time, without models or manuals. What remains layered ruins, burnt soil, abandoned wall stalls, a story not just of innovation, but of risk. For every thriving settlement, there was one that failed. And in each failure was a decision: rebuild, relocate, or change. In the Neolithic world, permanence was never guaranteed. But from collapse came continuity carried by those who moved forward. The earliest farmers left no written records, no monumental inscriptions, no dynastic tombs, but the world they built through grain, stone, clay, and fire set in motion every transformation that followed. From cities to writing systems, organized governance to warfare. The architecture of civilization rose from foundations first laid by Neolithic communities. Their inheritance runs through every structure of the ancient and modern world. The domestication of plants and animals created the first predictable food surplus in human history. With consistent harvests, societies could support more people. Population growth accelerated. Villages expanded. Labor became more specialized. No longer did every individual need to hunt or gather. Some people became full-time toolmakers, potters, or traders. Others took roles in construction, ritual, or leadership. This was the beginning of occupational differentiation. Over time, roles became more formalized. Authority structures emerged not just from physical dominance, but from control over resources, land, and religious or symbolic capital. In the late Neolithic, evidence of inequality becomes more pronounced. At sites like Varna in modern-day Bulgaria, dated to around 4500 BCE. Burials include gold ornaments, copper tools, and decorative weapons far in excess of daily necessity. In one grave, more than 1,000 gold items were placed with a single individual. The differentiation between rich and poor, powerful and common, had begun to crystallize. As societies grew, so did complexity. Managing water, storing grain, distributing labor, these required more than informal agreements. Early administrative tools appear long before written language. In Mesopotamia, small clay tokens were used by 8000 BCE to represent quantities of goods, livestock, grain, oil. By 3500 BCE, these evolved into sealed clay envelopes known as bulla, each enclosing tokens and stamped with symbols. Eventually, the symbols themselves were impressed into wet clay tablets. Writing was born not from literature, but from accounting. The Sumerians of southern Mesopotamia developed cuneiform script around 3200 BCE. Its earliest uses recorded temple transactions, inventories, and contracts. Over time, the script expanded to include myths, laws, and royal decrees. But its roots, economic, agricultural, and bureaucratic, were firmly embedded in the systems created by Neolithic farmers. Urbanization followed a similar trajectory. As populations concentrated near rivers and fertile plains, early towns evolved into the world's first cities. By 4000 BCE, Uruk, located in present-day Iraq, had an estimated population of over 40,000. It featured temples, administrative buildings, markets, and districts for various crafts. Organized planning, monumental construction, and coordinated labor defined these early urban centers. They were made possible by surplus agriculture and the social frameworks inherited from earlier farming communities. Law emerged from the need to regulate increasingly complex interactions, trade, property, disputes, labor arrangements. Marriage all required formal rules. The earliest known law code, attributed to Urinamu of around 2100 BCE, codified penalties for theft, violence, and contractual violations. These codes were not invented in a vacuum. They formalized customs that had likely governed Neolithic villages for centuries, rules passed down through oral tradition, enforced by community consensus or leadership. Conflict, too, took on new forms. In mobile forager societies, Small-scale skirmishes and disputes were limited by mobility. In settled, resource-rich farming communities, land became fixed and increasingly valuable. Surplus could be stored, stolen, or controlled. Archaeological evidence from early Neolithic Europe and the Near East includes palisades, weapons caches, and mass graves, suggesting organized violence. One of the clearest examples comes from the site of Talheim in southern Germany. A mass grave, dated to around 5000 BCE, contains the remains of 34 individuals, men, women, and children, all killed by blunt force trauma. The pattern suggests a coordinated attack, not random violence. This was not just interpersonal conflict. It was the beginning of organized warfare, shaped by resource competition and territorial defense. The spiritual systems of Neolithic communities also laid groundwork for institutional religion. Shrines within homes, ancestor worship, fertility rituals all evolved into structured pantheons, priesthoods, and monumental temples. By the 3rd millennium BCE, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia stood as expressions of divine order, replacing the small household altars of earlier settlements, but rooted in the same impulse to explain and influence the cycles of nature and society. The domesticated landscape became the model for controlled environments. Canals redirected rivers, terraced fields restructured hillsides. Agricultural calendars synchronized human activity with seasonal change. From this, the idea of centralized planning emerged not just in agriculture, but in governance, military campaigns, and monumental construction. The division of labor, writing, cities, religion, law, and statecraft were not spontaneous inventions. They were responses to challenges first faced by Neolithic farmers, feeding large populations, distributing goods, managing labor, resolving disputes, organizing ritual. Every problem that confronted the ancient city had already been encountered. In smaller form, in early agricultural villages, by the end of the Neolithic period, around 3000 BCE, the foundations were in place. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and along the Yellow River, the first civilizations began to rise, shaped by its environment, but sharing common roots. These civilizations expanded, conquered, and recorded their deeds. They left behind inscriptions, monuments, and imperial borders, but they built on older systems developed quietly in the stone and mud of Neolithic farms, fields, and homes. The people who first sowed grain, shaped clay, and planned villages did not call themselves builders of civilization. Yet without them, there would have been no civilization to build. The tools of empire, the logic of bureaucracy, and the rhythms of complex societies all began in those early settlements. Their innovations were not erased by time. They were absorbed, adapted, and amplified. The legacy of the Neolithic world lies beneath the surface of every later ancient written but enduring in most schoolbooks. History begins with the cities of Sumer, the pyramids of Egypt, or the laws of Babylon. But the structures that made those civilizations possible, the systems, patterns, and behaviors, were already in place thousands of years earlier, long before writing, before kings, before recorded time. The people of the Neolithic world do not appear in chronicles or annals, yet they built the foundations on which everything else was constructed. What they left behind is not measured in monuments or conquests, but in choices. The choice to stay in one place, to cultivate the land, to build homes of mud and wood, to raise animals not just for the hunt, but for herding. These decisions reshaped human existence. The legacy of that shift is visible everywhere today. The foods that dominate global agriculture, wheat, barley, millet, rice, were first domesticated by Neolithic farmers. The earliest known strains of wheat were cultivated in the Levant over 10,000 years ago. That grain, selectively bred over generations, fed the laborers of Uruk, the builders of Rome, and continues to sustain billions. Agriculture wasn't just a means to survive, it changed how people thought. Seasonal cycles became fixed in human memory. Time became measurable, structured. From that came calendars, festivals, planting schedules, and, eventually, the organization of workforces and institutions. Even the layout of modern settlements can trace their ancestry to the clustered homes of early farming villages. In Cataluyuk, houses were built side by side, with shared walls and no streets. Access came through rooftops, which doubled as pathways. That modeled ends, interconnected, and communal, set a precedent for urban planning that would echo into future civilizations. But the inheritance wasn't only practical, it was psychological. Settling the land meant claiming it. Ownership emerged. With it came hierarchy, inequality, and social control. The division between those who produced food and those who managed its distribution widened. Over time, surplus turned into power. That process, first visible in the late Neolithic, is still at the center of economic and political life. Religions, too, though vastly evolved, retain elements rooted in Neolithic belief systems. Fertility figures, seasonal rituals, ancestor reverence, and the sanctity of the land are present in traditions across the world, from ancient Middle Eastern temples to Andean offerings to the earth. Before gods were named in stone, they were sensed in the soil, the sky, and the cycles of growth and decay. In the Neolithic era, death and memory were embedded in the home itself. Across Anatolia and the Levant, it was common to bury the dead beneath the floors of houses. Entire generations were interred in the same living spaces. Skulls were plastered, painted, and kept close. Ancestors were not forgotten, they were present, woven into daily life. That memory, however, was not written. It was not archived or engraved. The Neolithic world left no written history. What survives are bones, tools, potsherds, and the soil itself. Their story must be reconstructed through excavation, carbon dating, and material analysis. Yet, what emerges is clear. These were not rudimentary societies. They were sophisticated, adaptive, and deeply human. In modern times, their remains often lie hidden beneath modern roads, cities, or fields. In places like Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and southeastern Europe, Neolithic layers have been uncovered beneath layers of Bronze Age, Iron Age, Roman, and modern occupation. The past is literally beneath our feet, often destroyed before it can be studied. The loss is not just archaeological, it is cultural. The Neolithic era is still widely misunderstood, overshadowed by empires and pharaohs. But in many ways, it is more relevant. It marks the first time humans transformed their environment, not out of instinct, but by design. The first time they altered ecosystems, managed animals, and engineered food sources. That transformation continues today at a planetary scale. Modern debates around food security, land use, environmental degradation, and social inequality all echo problems first confronted in the Neolithic period. Soil exhaustion, resource competition, and population pressure were not products of modernity. They were part of the agricultural equation from the beginning. There's also something deeper at stake. The people of the Neolithic are often imagined as primitive, simple, or unsophisticated, but the archaeological record paints a different picture. They were skilled artisans, traders, builders, and thinkers. They created technologies from necessity: pottery, weaving, groundstone tools. They organized communities without writing or central authority, and they did so for thousands of years. Their resilience, without empires, without markets, without armies, offers a counterpoint to modern assumptions about complexity and success. Long before the rise of civilization as we define it, people had already solved the core problems of survival, cooperation, and continuity. They're not remembered in names or dates. Their graves bear no titles, but their impact is measurable. Every meal drawn from cultivated soil, every city mapped by zoning, every ritual tied to seasons. Each one carries traces of their original logic. The Neolithic era is not a distant curiosity. It is our origin point. It contains the first evidence of how humans learned to live together, shape the land, bury their dead, plan their future, not through myth or legend, but through tangible, daily life. The history of kings, wars, and nations may dominate textbooks, but the real revolution, the one that still defines how we live, happened thousands of years earlier, in fields, hearths, and villages built by people whose names we will never know. People who, without monuments or armies, changed the direction of human history. Their legacy surrounds us. We just stopped noticing.